Think Cuba is just about cigars, classic cars, and communism? Well, wait until you find out about the country's dual internet system, where most citizens live in a completely different online world than tourists. You won't believe the extreme luggage penalties that can cost you $10 per extra pound, or how Cuba became the first country to eliminate mother-to-child HIV transmission, while most citizens still can't afford basic internet access. Number 15. Cuba operates two completely separate internet systems, one for tourists and one for locals that's basically a censored intranet. Here's what most visitors never realize. When you connect to Wi-Fi in Cuban hotels or tourist areas, you're accessing the global internet that costs around $1 to $2 per hour. But the majority of Cubans use a domestic network called SNET, a completely isolated system that only connects to Cuban websites and services. Wait until you find out the shocking part. This domestic internet costs just 25 cents per hour, but it's heavily monitored and censored by the government. Imagine living in a world where Google, Facebook, YouTube, and most international news sites simply don't exist unless you can afford the expensive tourist internet. You heard right, Cuba essentially runs two parallel digital universes, and which one you access depends entirely on how much money you have. For context, the average Cuban salary is about $30 per month, making the global internet a luxury most can't afford for more than a few minutes. This creates a bizarre situation where Cuban doctors and engineers, some of the most educated people in Latin America, live in an information bubble that tourists can easily escape with their credit cards. Number 16. If you pack just 6 extra pounds over Cuba's strict 55-pound luggage limit, you'll face a shocking $60 fine at customs. Cuba restricts total incoming luggage weight to exactly 25 kilograms or 55 pounds per person, period. Here's the scary part. They actually weigh your luggage at customs, and every single extra kilogram costs you $10. That's about 1,200 Cuban pesos, which represents nearly half a month's salary for the average Cuban worker. Sounds unbelievable, but tourists regularly get hit with these fees when bringing gifts for Cuban friends or family members. You heard right. Bringing an extra pair of shoes or some medicine for relatives can literally cost you more than what most Cubans earn in weeks. The maximum overweight allowance is just 5 extra kilograms, after which they'll simply refuse your luggage entirely. Think about this. While Americans casually pack 70 to 80-pound suitcases for international trips, Cuba treats anything over 55 pounds like you're smuggling contraband. This creates awkward scenes at Havana Airport where travelers desperately repack their suitcases in front of customs officers, throwing away personal items they can't afford to pay the extreme penalties for. Even more bizarre, there's an additional 10-kilogram allowance for certain items, but navigating these rules requires understanding Cuba's complex import regulations that change frequently. So, for nearly 30 years, Cuba actually had two different currencies running at the same time, which made the economy so complicated that, honestly, even locals struggled to figure it out. Up until January of 2021, there were the Cuban peso, the cup, and the Cuban convertible peso, the CUC. But here's where it gets absolutely wild. The exchange rate between these two depended on whether you were a tourist, a government worker, or just a regular citizen. And get this, if you were a state enterprise, 1 CUC equaled 1 cup, which also equaled $1. But for regular Cubans trying to exchange money, 1 CUC was worth 24 cups. That means the same currency had a 2,400% difference in value depending on who you were and where you exchanged it. Yeah, you heard that right. Imagine if the US used $2 at the same time, and depending on your job or status, each dollar could buy you totally different amounts of stuff. This set up a really strange parallel economy. Tourists paid for everything in the strong currency, while locals had to get by with the weaker one. Think budgeting in America is tough? Try living in a place where your salary is paid in one currency, but half the stores only take the other one that's worth 24 times more. So, Cubans became experts at currency arbitrage, always calculating tricky exchange rates for even basic things like food or rent. Cuban law says you have to declare exactly how much cash you're carrying when you leave the country, and taking out more than $5,000 without the right bank paperwork is totally illegal. Here's something most tourists just don't realize. Cuba tracks every single peso and dollar that comes in or goes out of the country with almost military-level precision. It sounds unbelievable, but if you want to leave with more than $5,000, you have to prove to Cuban customs that you got that money legally from an official Cuban bank, complete with receipts and transaction records, and you won't believe how seriously they take this. If you try to leave with cash that isn't documented, They can confiscate it on the spot, hit you with big fines, or even charge you with a crime. This leads to some pretty hilarious situations where tourists who arrived in Cuba with $6,000 suddenly realize they can't legally take home their leftover money without dealing with a mountain of paperwork. The scary part is, lots of visitors become accidental cash smugglers just because they don't know about this rule, especially since the economy is so cash-based that you're always handling large amounts of physical money. It's kind of absurd. You can bring in as much cash as you want, but taking it back out means proving a paper trail that most tourists never even think about. And even stranger, this rule partly exists because Cuba wants to stop its own citizens from collecting foreign currency, so your leftover vacation money basically becomes contraband as soon as you try to leave. Cuba offers totally free healthcare and education to everyone, but the average doctor makes just $67 a month, while taxi drivers can easily earn $300 or more from tourist tips. This upside-down economy has created one of the most educated, yet financially struggling professional classes anywhere in the world. Wait until you hear this. Cuban doctors, who get world-class medical training and often work in some of the best hospitals in Latin America, actually take home less money than restaurant servers in Havana's tourist hotspots. That's right. The same surgeon who might do a complicated operation in the morning could be driving an Uber at night just to afford groceries. Here's the crazy part. Cuba has achieved some amazing health milestones, like being the first country to eliminate mother-to-child HIV transmission, but its medical professionals still struggle to pay for basic things. It sounds hard to believe, but a lot of Cuban doctors actually leave medicine to become tour guides, taxi drivers, or restaurant workers, just because serving tourists pays so much more than saving lives. This has led to a brain drain where some of the Caribbean's most talented professionals give up their careers for jobs based on tips. Think about the irony. Cuba trains doctors who are so skilled that other countries want to hire them for international missions, yet those same doctors can't afford to buy meat regularly at home. So you end up with a society where education and public service are deeply respected, but just making ends meet often means leaving your trained profession behind. Cuban customs officials will actually confiscate your electronic devices if they find any content that's critical of the government, and they regularly search phones, laptops, and tablets at the airport using special software. Here's something most travelers never see coming. Cuba has digital forensics teams at Jose Marti International Airport who can scan your devices for banned content in just a few minutes after you arrive. And wait until you hear how thorough they are. Customs agents use advanced software to look for keywords, images, and even deleted files that might have political criticism, religious material, or information about human rights. You won't believe how far these searches go. They'll check your social media posts, text messages, photos, browser history, and even your download folders for anything they think is counter-revolutionary. Sounds kind of paranoid, but tourists have actually had their iPhones taken away just for having news articles about Cuban protests saved in their reading apps. And here's the really scary part. If they find something they don't like, they can ban you from entering the country, keep your devices forever, or even detain you for questioning. Think you can just delete everything before you fly? Think again. Their forensic software can recover deleted files and social media activity from months or even years ago. This leads to the absurd situation where visitors have to scrub their entire digital lives before coming to Cuba, deleting family photos that happen to show American flags or removing news apps that automatically download stories about Cuban politics. Even more bizarre, the rules about what's prohibited content are super vague, which gives customs officials a lot of power to decide what counts as a threat to national security. Cuba imports roughly 80% of its food despite having fertile agricultural land and perfect growing conditions, creating a situation where tropical fruits cost more than imported canned goods. Here's the shocking reality that even agricultural experts can't fully explain. An island nation with a year-round growing season and rich soil somehow fails to feed itself, and must rely on expensive food imports from countries thousands of miles away. Wait until you find out the absurd specifics. Fresh mangoes, which grow abundantly on Cuban trees, often cost more in Havana markets than imported Spanish olives or canned tomatoes from Italy. You heard right. Cuba's agricultural system is so dysfunctional that locally grown produce is frequently more expensive than food shipped across oceans. Here's where it gets absolutely insane. The government controls all large-scale farming, and bureaucratic inefficiencies mean that crops often rot in fields while Cubans wait in line for imported substitutes. Sounds unbelievable, but you'll see Cuban families paying premium prices for foreign apples while local fruit falls unused from trees in their neighborhoods. This has created a bizarre economy where being self-sufficient in food production would actually save Cuban families hundreds of dollars per year. Yet government policies make local farming so unprofitable that most agricultural workers abandon their fields for tourism jobs. Think about the environmental and economic absurdity. Cuba burns fossil fuels to import food that could easily grow in their backyard, while simultaneously having some of the world's most advanced agricultural research centers. The result is a country where a simple salad made from local ingredients costs more than a processed meal made from imported components, turning basic nutrition into a luxury item for many Cuban families. Cuban internet cafes charge $1.50 per hour for Wi-Fi access, but the average Cuban would need to work 12 hours just to afford 1 hour online. Here's the mathematical reality that shows just how disconnected most Cubans are from the digital world. With average monthly salaries around $30, spending even 2 hours online per month would consume 10% of a typical worker's entire income. Wait until you find out the shocking comparison. While Americans spend an average of 7 hours per day online, most Cubans can afford maybe 30 minutes per week if they sacrifice other necessities. You won't believe how this digital divide plays out in daily life. Cuban students often can't complete basic research assignments because accessing educational websites costs more per hour than their families spend on food per day. Here's the crazy part. Cuba has Wi-Fi hotspots throughout Havana and other cities, creating the illusion of digital connectivity. But for locals, these represent expensive luxuries rather than basic utilities. Sounds unbelievable, but you'll see Cubans carefully rationing their online time like it's a precious resource, quickly checking email and social media before logging off to save money. This creates hilarious yet sad situations where educated professionals must choose between staying connected with the world and buying dinner for their families. Think about trying to run a business, maintain relationships, or stay informed about world events when every minute online costs you the equivalent of an hour's wages. The result is that Cuba's impressive literacy rates and educational achievements are undermined by digital poverty that keeps citizens isolated from global information and opportunities. Cuba legally allows private restaurants called paladares to operate in people's homes, but limits them to exactly 12 seats and prohibits serving lobster, beef, or shrimp to customers. Here's where Cuban economic policy gets absolutely bizarre. The government encourages private enterprise while simultaneously micromanaging it with rules so specific they seem designed to ensure failure. Wait until you find out the shocking details. Restaurant owners can face heavy fines or closure for having 13 chairs instead of 12, or for serving a surf and turf dish that includes prohibited proteins. You heard right. In a Caribbean island nation surrounded by seafood and with cattle ranches throughout the countryside, private restaurants are banned from serving the most profitable menu items. Here's the insane part. These same forbidden ingredients are readily available in government-run restaurants, creating an artificial competitive advantage for state-owned businesses. Sounds unbelievable, but paladar owners often resort to elaborate workarounds, like officially calling lobster large shrimp or serving beef as special pork to avoid prosecution. This has created a shadow economy of culinary creativity where private chefs must become masters of linguistic gymnastics and ingredient substitution. Think about running a restaurant where your success depends not on food quality or customer service, but on your ability to navigate absurd bureaucratic restrictions that change frequently without notice. The result is that some of Cuba's most talented chefs waste their energy circumventing nonsensical rules rather than focusing on creating exceptional dining experiences, while customers miss out on authentic Cuban cuisine because the best ingredients are legally off-limits. Number 6. Cuban law prohibits citizens from killing cows under any circumstances, with violations punishable by up to 10 years in prison, a sentence that's actually more severe than many violent crimes. Here's the shocking reality of Cuba's cattle protection system. Cows are considered state property regardless of who owns or raises them, and slaughtering one without government permission is treated as a serious felony, equivalent to armed robbery. Wait until you find out how absurdly this plays out. Farmers who raise cattle from birth, feed them daily, and depend on them for survival can face a decade in prison for butchering their own livestock during food shortages or family emergencies. You won't believe the bureaucratic nightmare involved in legal cattle slaughter. Owners must navigate months of paperwork, inspections, and approvals from multiple government agencies just to turn their own cows into food. Here's where it gets completely insane. The same legal system that gives minor sentences for assault or theft treats cow killing as one of the most serious crimes in the penal code. Sounds unbelievable, but Cuban farmers regularly watch their cattle die of disease or old age rather than risk prison sentences by putting them out of their misery or using them to feed their families. This has created a bizarre agricultural system where livestock owners become prisoners of their own animals, unable to make basic farming decisions without risking their freedom. Think about the psychological pressure on rural families who must choose between watching their children go hungry and facing a decade in prison for slaughtering an animal they've raised. The result is that Cuba maintains larger cattle herds on paper while actual beef production remains artificially low, creating meat shortages that force the country to import expensive beef from other nations. Number 5. Cuba's education system produces more doctors per capita than any other country in the world. Yet many Cuban physicians have never used email regularly or browsed the internet freely due to digital restrictions and economic barriers. Here's the mind-blowing contradiction at the heart of Cuban society. The same government that creates world-class medical professionals simultaneously cuts them off from the digital tools that modern medicine requires. Wait until you find out the shocking extent of this digital isolation. Cuban doctors often graduate with extensive knowledge of tropical diseases, surgical techniques, and pharmaceutical research, but many have never used medical databases, online journals, or telemedicine platforms that their counterparts in other countries consider essential. You heard right. Cuba trains physicians who are skilled enough to work in international missions and emergency situations, yet they've been educated in an information bubble that excludes most current global medical knowledge. Here's the absurd reality. Cuban medical schools use textbooks that are often decades old because accessing current research requires internet connections that most students and even professors cannot afford. Sounds unbelievable, but you'll find Cuban doctors who can perform complex surgeries using improvised tools and limited resources, yet struggle to adapt to electronic health records or digital diagnostic equipment when working abroad. This creates a surreal situation where some of the world's most resourceful medical professionals are also the most digitally isolated, forced to rely on outdated reference materials and word-of-mouth updates about medical advances. Think about trying to practice modern medicine without access to Google, medical journals, or even email communication with colleagues. That's the reality for thousands of Cuban healthcare workers. The result is a medical system that produces remarkably skilled, hands-on practitioners while leaving them unprepared for the digital aspects of 21st century healthcare, creating both advantages and disadvantages when Cuban doctors work internationally. Cuban teenagers legally cannot access social media, own cell phones, or use internet cafes without special government permits, yet many become sophisticated hackers and digital entrepreneurs through underground networks. Here's the incredible paradox of Cuba's youth culture. The same government restrictions that aim to limit digital access have inadvertently created one of the most tech-savvy underground communities in Latin America. Wait until you find out the shocking ingenuity involved. Cuban teens create elaborate digital networks called SNET that operate completely independently of government internet, using gaming consoles, modified routers, and peer-to-peer connections to share everything from movies to software across entire neighborhoods. You won't believe how sophisticated these networks have become. Young Cubans have developed their own social media platforms, online gaming tournaments, and digital marketplaces that operate entirely offline, creating a parallel internet that the government can't easily monitor or control. Here's where it gets absolutely amazing. Kids who officially can't access Facebook or YouTube have taught themselves advanced networking, programming, and cybersecurity skills that would impress technology professionals in Silicon Valley. Sounds unbelievable, but Cuban teenagers regularly outperform their international peers in programming competitions despite having limited access to formal computer education or online resources. This has created a generation of digital natives who learn technology through pure necessity and creativity rather than formal instruction. Think about the irony. Government attempts to control information access have produced some of the most innovative young hackers and digital entrepreneurs in the Caribbean. The result is that Cuba's most restricted generation has paradoxically become its most digitally literate, with skills and networks that often surpass those of teens in countries with unlimited internet access, proving that creativity and determination can overcome even the most sophisticated censorship systems. Cuba imports ice from other countries despite having abundant electricity and manufacturing capabilities because government-controlled ice production is so inefficient that buying frozen water from abroad costs less than making it domestically. Here's the absolutely mind-boggling economic reality. An island nation with reliable power generation and industrial infrastructure finds it cheaper to ship frozen water across hundreds of miles of ocean rather than operate its own ice factories. Wait until you find out the shocking specifics. Cuban ice imports often come from as far away as Colombia and Mexico, requiring specialized refrigerated shipping that cost exponentially more than local production should cost, yet still provide savings compared to domestic ice manufacturing. You heard right. Cuba literally imports frozen water while having the technology, electricity, and raw materials needed to produce unlimited ice locally. Here's where the economics become completely insane. The same government that prides itself on self-sufficiency and independence from foreign markets regularly purchases one of the simplest manufactured goods imaginable from other countries. Sounds unbelievable, but this highlights the broader dysfunction in Cuba's state-controlled manufacturing sector, where bureaucratic inefficiencies make even basic production unprofitable compared to international alternatives. You'll find Cuban businesses paying premium prices for imported ice, while local ice factories sit idle or operate at massive losses due to overstaffing, poor equipment maintenance, and administrative overhead that multiplies production costs. Think about the environmental and economic absurdity. Cuba burns fossil fuels to import a product that requires nothing more than water and electricity, both of which they have in abundance. The result is that Cuban consumers pay inflated prices for imported ice during their tropical heat, while their own government acknowledges that domestic production is so broken that foreign ice becomes a rational economic choice, creating a perfect example of how central planning can make even the simplest industrial processes unprofitable. Cuban government officials created a special tourist apartheid system where Cuban citizens are legally prohibited from entering most hotels, beaches, and restaurants in their own country unless they're working there or accompanied by foreigners. Here's the shocking legal reality. Cuba operates a two-tiered system where your citizenship status determines which parts of your own nation you can access. Wait until you find out how extensive these restrictions are. Cuban nationals cannot book rooms in many luxury hotels, eat at resort restaurants, or even walk on certain beach areas that are designated exclusively for international visitors paying in foreign currency. You won't believe the enforcement mechanisms. Hotel security guards regularly check IDs to ensure Cuban citizens aren't accessing tourist-only facilities, and violations can result in fines, arrest, or being banned from tourist areas entirely. Here's the deeply troubling part. Families are often separated at resort entrances, with Cuban spouses or children forced to wait outside while their foreign relatives enjoy amenities that their own tax money helps subsidize. Sounds unbelievable, but this creates daily humiliation for educated, professional Cubans who are treated as second-class citizens in their homeland simply because they don't carry foreign passports. This system extends beyond hotels to include certain restaurants, shops, and even transportation services that prioritize foreigners over locals. Think about the psychological impact of being prohibited from accessing the nicest parts of your own country while watching tourists freely enjoy privileges denied to you based solely on your citizenship. The result is a form of economic segregation that reinforces class divisions and creates resentment among Cuban citizens who feel like strangers in their own land, while simultaneously forcing them to depend on foreign visitors for economic opportunities that should be available to all citizens equally. Number 1. Cuba has achieved one of the world's highest literacy rates and eliminated diseases like polio and measles. Yet citizens must bring their own light bulbs, bed sheets, and toilet paper when admitted to hospitals, while doctors often lack basic medical supplies like aspirin and bandages. Here's the ultimate Cuban paradox that perfectly encapsulates the contradictions of the system. A country that has mastered complex medical procedures and public health campaigns cannot provide the most basic hospital amenities. Wait until you find out the shocking reality. Cuban hospitals that perform cutting-edge surgeries and achieve impressive patient outcomes require families to bring everything from soap and towels to surgical gloves and syringes because the supply chain for basic medical materials has completely collapsed. You heard right. The same healthcare system that eliminated mother-to-child HIV transmission and trains doctors for international missions operates with shortages so severe that patients must BYO their hospital experience. Here's where it becomes absolutely surreal. Cuban physicians who can improvise life-saving treatments using household items and perform complex operations with minimal equipment often cannot access basic pain medications or antibiotics for their patients. Sounds unbelievable, but Cuban families planning for hospital stays pack like they're going camping, bringing everything from light bulbs to replace burned-out fixtures to cleaning supplies because hospital maintenance has become the patient's responsibility. This has created a healthcare system where medical expertise is world-class, but infrastructure is third-world, producing doctors who are incredibly skilled at improvisation and creative problem-solving while being frustrated by preventable supply shortages. Think about the irony. Cuba exports medical professionals to other countries, while its own citizens must crowdsource basic medical supplies through family networks and black market purchases. The result is a system that achieves remarkable public health outcomes through professional excellence and community support, while simultaneously demonstrating how centralized resource allocation can fail even the most essential services, creating a healthcare experience that is simultaneously impressive and heartbreaking. So we've just discovered Cuba's most fascinating contradictions, from dual internet systems to imported ice in a tropical paradise. Which one shocked you the most? Have you ever experienced Cuba's unique economic paradoxes firsthand? Subscribe for more mind-blowing facts about countries that will completely change how you see the world.